She appeared like any other traveler in Seat 3B, perusing a novel during the standard flight to Boston. No one recognized her true name or celebrated reputation when the Airbus A350's engines disintegrated at 37,000 feet, disabling systems and incapacitating the crew. Two F-35 stealth fighters shattered strict mission silence just to acknowledge her call sign. Before you discover the full narrative, tell us in the comments what country you're from, and please subscribe. Commander Jordan Hayes. Valkyrie shifted her weight in Seat 3B of Trans-American Flight 515, finally letting herself unwind after 3 grueling weeks at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. The top-secret test flights she'd been running had pushed both machine and pilot to their breaking points, probing flight envelopes that were purely theoretical until she proved they were achievable in the real world. She wore plain civilian attire, slacks, a gray sweater, and comfortable loafers. Nothing about her hinted that she was one of the Navy's most decorated test pilots. A holder of numerous speed and altitude records and the pioneer of flight test methodologies that had redefined naval aviation. To her fellow passengers, she seemed like any other professional heading from San Francisco to Boston on this Thursday evening. The Airbus A350-900 was a spectacular machine. One of the most sophisticated commercial jetliners ever conceived, it ferried 200 souls through the clear night skies at 37,000 feet, cruising at 560 miles per hour toward its destination. The immense twin-engine jet was a testament to modern engineering with systems so advanced it could nearly fly itself. Captain Marcus Thorne, a 25-year veteran of commercial airlines, and First Officer Chloe Diaz, who had joined the company 6 years ago after serving as a Marine Corps aviator, were managing the routine cross-country journey with practiced professionalism. Both were immensely qualified pilots who had commanded innumerable flights across the nation and the globe. Flight attendants moved with grace through the cabin, offering refreshments to passengers who were reading, watching films on their tablets, or dozing in their seats. The cabin was calm, filled only with the soft drone of the engines and the low murmur of sporadic conversations. Jordan had shut her eyes, attempting to clear her mind of the experimental aircraft she had been putting through its paces for the last 3 weeks. The XR-9 prototype she was flying was so secret that even dwelling on it in public felt risky. The craft could sustain G-forces that would incapacitate most pilots, execute maneuvers that appeared to defy the laws of aerodynamics, and attain speeds and altitudes that tested the absolute limits of current technology. During her final test flight just 2 days ago, she had pushed the XR-9 to 100,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 4.5, faster than any human had ever traveled in a conventional aircraft. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, demanding instantaneous decisions and control adjustments at the very edge of human reaction time. But this evening she was merely another passenger, exhausted from weeks of high-stakes work and anticipating a few days of well-earned leave in Boston before heading back to Pax River for the next round of trials. No call signs, no prototypes, no life-or-death choices at impossible velocities and heights. That peaceful obscurity endured for precisely 2 hours, 19 minutes, and 41 seconds after departure. Jordan perceived the minute shift in engine tone before anyone else on the plane registered anything was amiss. Her years in flight testing had made her acutely sensitive to any fluctuation in an aircraft's performance, any noise that was even marginally out of place. The alteration was so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But to Jordan's expert ear, it was as loud as a klaxon. Something was failing in the number 1 engine. She opened her eyes, listening intently. The vibration signature through the fuselage felt slightly off-kilter, and there was a barely noticeable change in the aircraft's trim, suggesting an asymmetric thrust problem. Her mind instantly began cycling through scenarios: a partial flameout, compressor stall, or worse. Captain Thorne's voice crackled over the intercom about 30 seconds later, composed and professional, but with an edge that Jordan identified as suppressed urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're dealing with a small technical glitch in one of our engines. As a precautionary step, we'll be descending to a slightly lower altitude and altering our course. This is a standard procedure, and there's no reason for concern. Please stay in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We'll have you back on our way shortly. Jordan knew this wasn't small. The medley of sounds and sensations she was picking up pointed to something far more critical than a routine technical glitch. The minor adjustment in power, the almost imperceptible yaw in the aircraft's attitude, the faint increase in vibration. These were precursors to a major failure. In the flight deck, Thorne and Diaz were confronting a swiftly escalating crisis. What began as a standard engine parameter alert had rapidly become much more critical. The number 1 engine's exhaust gas temperature had soared unexpectedly, triggering a cascade of caution and warning lights. Engine 1 EGT is in the red, Diaz announced, her voice taut with professional focus as she monitored the engine displays. Oil pressure is falling, and I'm getting a chip detect warning. Thorne's hands flew across the engine controls, executing procedures he'd rehearsed hundreds of times in simulators, but never encountered in a real aircraft. Commencing Engine 1 shutdown checklist. This feels like it could be an uncontained failure. Before Diaz could reply, the number 1 engine exploded. The colossal Rolls-Royce Trent XWB engine, weighing over 15,000 pounds and capable of 97,000 pounds of thrust, experienced a catastrophic uncontained failure that spewed high-velocity metal shards in every direction. Fragments of turbine blades moving at supersonic speeds ripped through the engine nacelle and into the wing itself. The aircraft bucked violently as if hit by a giant fist. Warning lights flashed to life across every panel in the cockpit. Master caution and warning chimes flooded the flight deck with a cacophony of urgent electronic alerts. The aircraft instantly began to yaw to the left as the massive engine's thrust vanished and drag surged. Oh my God, Thorne wrestled with the controls as the Airbus A350 tried to roll left. We've lost Engine 1 entirely. I'm seeing multiple system failures. Diaz's training as a former Marine aviator kicked in as she started methodically working through the growing list of emergency checklists. Primary hydraulic system is gone. Backup hydraulics are showing pressure loss. We have fuel leaks in the left wing, and I'm seeing electrical bus failures across the board. The shrapnel from the detonated engine had done far more than destroy the power plant. It had sliced through hydraulic lines, ruptured fuel tanks, severed electrical conduits, and damaged control surfaces. The highly advanced Airbus A350 was quickly devolving into a marginally controllable glider. "Declare an emergency," Thorne commanded, as he battled to keep the wings level. "We need immediate vectors to the nearest major airport with emergency services." Diaz keyed the microphone with unsteady fingers. "Oakland Center, Trans-American 515. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have suffered an uncontained engine failure with multiple system casualties. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The reply from Oakland Center was instantaneous, the controller's voice calm and clear despite the dire nature of the call. "Trans-American 515, Oakland Center. We copy your mayday. Roger. We show you about 200 miles west of Denver. Denver International Airport is your closest suitable field. Turn left, heading 090. Emergency services are being alerted and will be standing by." But even as Thorne initiated the turn towards Denver, both pilots understood they had far bigger issues than just reaching an airport. The aircraft was growing increasingly difficult to fly, and they were losing altitude at a rate that made their arrival at any runway uncertain. The Airbus A350's sophisticated fly-by-wire flight control system was built to compensate for various malfunctions, but the extent of the damage from the engine explosion had surpassed the system's ability to maintain stable flight. Warning messages scrolled endlessly across the cockpit screens, reporting failures in systems the pilots had never imagined failing at the same time. "Controls are getting spongy," Thorne reported through clenched teeth. "I'm having to use a lot of physical force to hold our heading and altitude. Fuel system is showing major leaks from the left wing," Diaz added. "We're dumping fuel. At this rate, we might not have enough to make it to Denver." Thorne keyed the radio once more. "Oakland Center, Trans-American 515. We need immediate priority handling. Our situation is degrading rapidly. Multiple system failures, major fuel leaks, and we're having difficulty controlling the aircraft." "Trans-American 515, you have priority handling. All other air traffic is being cleared from your route. Denver emergency services are rolling. Medical teams and fire suppression are standing by." Over the next 10 minutes, Thorne and Diaz's predicament continued to worsen at a terrifying pace. More systems went offline as electrical fires began to smolder in the aircraft's wiring bundles. The smell of burning plastic started to seep into the cockpit, and Diaz began to feel dizzy from the noxious fumes. The passengers in the cabin knew that something was deeply wrong. The aircraft was shaking far more violently than any turbulence. Oxygen masks had dropped from the ceiling when cabin pressure fell due to structural breaches, and the bitter smell of smoke was becoming apparent throughout the passenger areas. Flight attendants hurried through the aisle, attempting to keep passengers calm and help with their oxygen masks, but a palpable fear was spreading as people understood this was no ordinary emergency. Some passengers were praying, others were phoning family members, and a few were sobbing as they confronted the real possibility that they might not survive. Jordan had donned her oxygen mask and was assessing the situation with the practiced eye of a test pilot who had confronted life-threatening emergencies many times. The combination of sounds, vibrations, and the aircraft's erratic flight path told her a story that was becoming progressively more dire. The Airbus A350 was still flying, but only just. The pilots were in a desperate fight to control an aircraft damaged well beyond the scope of standard emergency protocols. She could feel the pilots' irregular control inputs as they struggled with systems that were failing faster than they could be managed. Then, everything became much worse. First Officer Diaz suddenly slumped forward in her seat, her hands slipping from the controls and her head falling toward the instrument panel. Thorne glanced over in horror and saw that his first officer was unconscious, overcome by smoke inhalation from the electrical fires spreading through the plane. Chloe, respond!" Thorne shook her shoulder, but Diaz was unresponsive. Her breathing was shallow but present, suggesting she was alive but incapacitated by the toxic fumes that were now filling the cockpit. Thorne was now flying solo, commanding a crippled jet with 200 lives, depending entirely on his ability to keep the aircraft airborne long enough to find a runway. The Airbus A350 was a complex machine that normally required 2 pilots for safe operation. It was never meant to be flown with this many simultaneous failures and only one conscious pilot. Thorne keyed the radio, desperation now coloring his professional tone. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Trans-American 515. I've lost my first officer to smoke inhalation. Multiple systems are continuing to fail, and I'm losing control authority. I need immediate assistance." Oakland Center immediately started coordinating with military and civilian agencies to offer any possible aid, but there was little they could do for an aircraft that was barely flying, and still 180 miles from the nearest airport. Over the next 15 minutes, Thorne's situation went from critical to seemingly hopeless. More systems failed as electrical fires propagated through the aircraft. The flight controls grew increasingly sluggish, demanding tremendous physical exertion just to maintain a semblance of control. The fuel leaks were worsening, and Thorne knew they might exhaust their fuel before they reached Denver. In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to panic as the situation became undeniably life-threatening. The aircraft was shuddering violently, the smell of smoke was intensifying, and everyone sensed they were in mortal peril. Jordan unfastened her seatbelt and stood up, moving purposefully through the chaotic cabin toward the cockpit. Flight attendants were trying to keep order and assist passengers, but the situation was clearly beyond their training. A senior flight attendant named Linda intercepted Jordan as she approached the front of the plane. "Ma'am, you need to go back to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We're in an emergency." Jordan looked at the flight attendant with the calm, unwavering gaze of someone who had faced death many times and prevailed through skill and resolve. "I'm a pilot, a military test pilot. I may be able to help." Linda hesitated for only a second, reading Jordan's expression and seeing a certainty there that convinced her this was not a hysterical passenger causing a disturbance. "Follow me." Jordan arrived at the cockpit door just as Thorne was making another, more frantic radio call to air traffic control. Through the reinforced door she could hear the pandemonium inside, multiple alarms blaring, systems failing, and one pilot desperately trying to manage an impossible situation while his unconscious co-pilot was slumped in her seat. Jordan knocked sharply on the cockpit door. "Captain Thorne, this is Commander Hayes, United States Navy. I'm a test pilot with significant experience in emergency scenarios, requesting permission to assist." Thorne's voice came back instantly, thick with relief at the prospect of help from someone who might comprehend what he was up against. "Get in here now." Jordan entered the cockpit and immediately started processing the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had spent her career dealing with aircraft in extreme distress. First Officer Diaz was unconscious, but breathing, slumped in her seat with her oxygen mask askew. Captain Thorne was wrestling with flight controls that were barely responding. His face was drenched in sweat from the physical strain and mental stress of trying to keep the aircraft flying. Warning lights lit up every panel in the cockpit like a grotesque holiday display. Master caution and warning alarms provided a relentless electronic chorus of emergency alerts. The aircraft was obviously flying far beyond its normal operational limits, kept in the air only by Thorne's skill and sheer willpower. "What's your current situation?" Jordan asked calmly as she slid into the observer's seat behind the pilots, instantly beginning to analyze the flight data. "Uncontained failure of Engine 1 took out most of our systems," Thorne reported breathlessly, his voice strained from the exertion of flying the plane. "We've lost primary hydraulics entirely. Backup hydraulics are failing, massive fuel leaks from the left wing, electrical fires everywhere, and the flight controls are barely responsive." Jordan's mind immediately switched into the analytical state that had saved her life during countless test flights of experimental machines. She had encountered situations where prototypes were failing in ways their designers had never imagined, demanding split-second choices and unorthodox solutions that weren't in any manual. What systems are still online? Engine 2 is still operational but showing signs of FOD damage. Some electrical power from the backup bus. Manual reversion on the flight controls, but I'm having to use extreme force to get any reaction. Jordan scanned the instrument panels, drawing on years of experience with aircraft that were barely controllable or flying in configurations that defied every principle of standard flight operations. The Airbus A350's state was reminiscent of test flights, where she had intentionally placed experimental aircraft in extreme conditions to discover the boundaries of controllable flight. "We need to stop thinking of this as a standard aircraft emergency," Jordan told Thorne. "This is now an experimental flight test. We are going to fly this machine using methods that are not in any commercial aviation manual." "I don't know what you mean." "I've spent years flying aircraft that were not supposed to be able to fly. Prototypes with failing systems, experimental designs that existed at the very edge of aerodynamic possibility. This aircraft is now in that category, and we have to treat it as such." Jordan began giving instructions based on techniques she had pioneered during years of experimental test flying. Instead of battling against the aircraft's damaged state, she had Thorne work with the constraints imposed by the failures. "Reduce power on Engine 2 to 65%, she instructed. We're going to use the asymmetric thrust to help us with directional control instead of fighting it." Thorne complied with her instructions and immediately felt the aircraft become marginally more controllable as they stopped wrestling with the thrust imbalance and began using it as a control input. "Now stop trying to fly this like a normal A350. The flight control system is damaged beyond its operational parameters. We need to use elevator trim for pitch control instead of trying to muscle the primary yoke." For the next 20 minutes, Jordan coached Thorne through flying techniques that no commercial pilot had ever been trained for. She drew upon her experience with experimental aircraft that existed at the very limits of controllable flight, where conventional methods were useless and survival hinged on a fundamental understanding of aerodynamics. These were techniques she had perfected during test flights of aircraft that were intentionally configured to be almost uncontrollable, exploring flight regimes that existed in the undefined areas between normal flight and a complete loss of control. She had learned to fly aircraft that were missing control surfaces, had imbalanced configurations, or were damaged in ways that made normal flight impossible. Meanwhile, 80 miles to the east, two F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters were engaged in highly classified training maneuvers over the Utah desert. Major Jackson Ripper Cole and Captain Lena Ghost Petrova were flying in total radio silence, practicing deep strike tactics that demanded absolute stealth and communication security. The F-35s were the most advanced fighter jets ever created, capable of sustained supersonic flight at altitudes and speeds that made them effectively invisible to enemy radar. Their current training mission was to simulate an infiltration of heavily defended airspace without being detected, a scenario that required them to maintain complete radio silence for hours. Radio silence wasn't just recommended during these exercises, it was an absolute requirement. Any transmission could potentially give away their position and expose capabilities that were among the nation's most closely held military secrets. The pilots were drilled to maintain communication discipline even in emergencies, unless it was absolutely essential for their survival. But their sophisticated sensor suites were capable of monitoring civilian air traffic control frequencies, even while maintaining their own operational silence. The F-35's advanced avionics included sensors that could detect and analyze electronic signals from hundreds of miles away. Both pilots had been listening to the increasingly desperate calls from Trans-American 515 as its situation deteriorated. They could track the aircraft's position and trajectory with their sensors, observing as the crippled airliner struggled to maintain altitude and turn towards Denver. "Ripper, Ghost," Petrova called on their discreet tactical channel, which was encrypted and impossible for civilian receivers to detect. "Are you monitoring the civilian Mayday on frequency 1215? "Copy, Ghost. I've been tracking it for the last 20 minutes. Someone on that airliner is calling out recovery procedures that sound very familiar. Those are not standard commercial aviation methods. Through their advanced sensor systems, they could monitor not only the radio calls, but also the precise flight path of the Airbus A350. The aircraft was flying in a way that seemed impossible given the damage reports they'd heard. Ripper had a deep background in post-stall maneuvering and unconventional flight from his time as a test pilot before transitioning to the operational F-35 community. What he was seeing from the civilian airliner resembled advanced test pilot techniques that were far beyond normal commercial aviation training. "Ghost, whoever is flying that aircraft knows things they don't teach in civilian flight schools. Those are military test pilot procedures. Copy that. Should we break silence and offer assistance?" This question posed one of the most significant choices either pilot had ever confronted. Breaking radio silence would instantly compromise their training mission and potentially expose classified capabilities that had to remain secret. F-35 operations were among the most sensitive activities in the military, and unauthorized transmissions could have grave national security consequences. On the other hand, 200 civilian lives were on the line, and someone on that aircraft was exhibiting flying skills that suggested They might be a fellow military aviator who deserved support from their comrades in arms. Military protocol was clear on priorities. Human life superseded operational security in almost all situations, but the decision to break radio silence during a classified exercise was not to be taken lightly. Back on Transamerican 515, Jordan continued to coach Thorne through procedures that pushed the Airbus A350 well beyond its design parameters. She had him using techniques she had perfected during experimental test flights, methods that existed in the nebulous space between controlled flight and aerodynamic impossibility. "We are still losing altitude too fast," Thorne reported, his voice showing the strain of physical and mental fatigue from battling the barely controllable flight systems. "At this rate, we won't make Denver. We have to reduce our descent rate, but we're already at minimum controllable speed." Jordan calculated rapidly in her head, running through possibilities that existed outside of standard flight envelopes. In a normal aircraft with functioning systems, they would indeed be out of options, but her experience with experimental planes had taught her about flight regimes that existed beyond conventional operating parameters. There were areas of flight that traditional wisdom deemed impossible, regions where an aircraft shouldn't be able to maintain controlled flight. But the laws of physics still applied in those regions, and if you understood the aerodynamics well enough, it was sometimes possible to maintain a degree of control even in a post-stall condition. "We're going to try something that isn't in any manual," Jordan told Thorne. "I need you to trust me implicitly and follow my instructions precisely, even if they seem to contradict everything you've ever been taught about flying." Thorne looked at her with a mix of desperation and renewed hope. "At this point, I'll try anything. Standard procedures are failing us." Jordan had Thorne configure the aircraft in a manner that violated every principle of commercial aviation training. She had him increase the angle of attack beyond normal stall limits, use asymmetric power settings that would typically lead to a loss of control, and make control inputs that should have caused an immediate departure from controlled flight. Instead, the Airbus A350 entered a flight regime that existed in the margins of aerodynamic science. The aircraft was technically in a stalled state according to conventional definitions, but Jordan was managing the airflow over the wings and control surfaces to retain some measure of control authority. "How is this possible?" Thorne asked in disbelief as he felt the aircraft's sink rate decrease significantly, while somehow holding a steady heading. "Post-stall maneuvering," Jordan explained. "It's a technique developed for military test aircraft. The wing is stalled in the traditional sense, but we're managing the separated airflow to maintain some control effectiveness. The aircraft is flying in a region that civilian training says is impossible. The technique demanded constant, precise control inputs to maintain the delicate equilibrium between controlled flight and a complete departure from the flight envelope." Jordan had mastered these methods during test flights of experimental aircraft that were intentionally pushed beyond normal limits to explore the boundaries of what was possible. The F-35 pilots monitoring the situation were astonished by what they were witnessing. Ripper had extensive experience with post-stall maneuvering in fighter jets, but he had never seen these techniques applied to a large commercial airliner. Ghost, that's advanced test pilot stuff that's classified at the highest levels. Whoever is flying that plane has access to flight test techniques that are only taught at Pax River and Edwards. Copy that. This is definitely a military-trained aviator. The question is whether we break silence to offer our support. Ripper made a command decision that would later be studied in military ethics courses. We're breaking silence. The situation warrants compromising our exercise. 200 civilian lives trump operational security. He switched his radio to the emergency frequency that Transamerican 515 was using and made a transmission that would terminate their classified training exercise but potentially save lives. Transamerican 515. This is Ripper Flight. 2 F-35s monitoring your situation. We have been observing advanced maneuvering techniques that indicate military pilot training. What are the qualifications of your current pilot? In the airliner's cockpit, Thorne was stunned to hear from military aircraft he hadn't known were nearby. Jordan, however, instantly understood the significance of the transmission. F-35s did not break radio silence casually, especially during what was clearly a training mission. The fact that they were willing to compromise their mission to offer help showed the deep respect that military aviators had for one another. Jordan took the radio microphone from Thorne. "Ripper Flight, this is Commander Jordan Hayes, call sign Valkyrie, Naval Test Pilot School graduate. I'm assisting with emergency flight procedures." There was a moment of profound silence on the radio frequency. Then Ripper's voice returned, filled with recognition and professional awe. "Valkyrie. Commander Jordan Hayes. Ma'am, this is Major Cole. Call sign Ripper. We studied your test reports at the weapons school. Your work on high alpha flight regimes and post-stall maneuvering completely changed how we approach unconventional flight." Ghost's voice joined the conversation, equally filled with respect. "Ma'am, this is Captain Petrova. Call sign Ghost. Your research on asymmetric thrust control and battle damage tolerance saved my wingman during a training incident at Fallon last year. The techniques you pioneered are now standard curriculum for all F-35 pilots." Jordan felt a mix of professional pride and immense responsibility. Her fellow aviators knew her contributions to military aviation, but at this moment, the only thing that mattered was getting 200 innocent people safely to the ground. "I appreciate the acknowledgement, Ripper Flight, but we have 200 souls on this aircraft, and we're still not sure we can make it to a runway. We need all the support we can get." "Understood completely, Valkyrie. We are immediately coordinating with air traffic control and military authorities to provide maximum assistance. You will have priority handling and emergency support all the way to Denver." The F-35 pilots used their advanced communication suites and military command access to coordinate with both civilian and military agencies. Within minutes, every other aircraft in the vicinity had been rerouted. Emergency vehicles were being staged at Denver International Airport, and military search and rescue helicopters were being prepped for immediate launch if necessary. The pilots also used their sensors to provide detailed tracking data on the Airbus A350's position and flight path, giving air traffic controllers more accurate information than civilian radar could offer. For the next hour, Jordan continued to fly the crippled airliner using techniques that existed nowhere in commercial aviation manuals. She guided Thorne through maneuvers that kept the aircraft airborne despite failures that should have been utterly catastrophic. The Airbus A350 was flying in conditions that were theoretically impossible, kept aloft only by Jordan's expert application of aerodynamic principles that existed at the very fringes of controlled flight. Every control input required precise timing and exact application to prevent the aircraft from departing entirely from controlled flight. The F-35s maintained a discreet escort at a distance that kept them off civilian radar, but close enough to monitor the situation and provide instant assistance if needed. They couldn't physically help fly the plane, but their presence and coordination efforts ensured that everything possible was being done to support the emergency. As they approached Denver, Jordan faced her most daunting challenge yet. Landing a severely damaged aircraft with minimal control authority would demand a level of precision flying that existed at the absolute limits of human capability and aircraft performance. The approach to Denver International would normally be routine for a skilled airline crew, but with damaged controls, asymmetric thrust, and barely functioning systems, it would require flying skills that very few pilots in the world possessed. "Marcus, the landing approach is going to be unlike anything you've ever trained for in your career," Jordan explained as they began their descent toward Denver. "I need you to follow my instructions exactly, without question, even if they seem wrong." "I'm with you all the way, Commander. You've kept us in the air this long." Jordan configured the approach using parameters that violated every standard operating procedure in commercial aviation: a higher than normal approach speed to maintain control authority, an unusual glide path that compensated for the aircraft's damaged state, and power settings that would normally be considered reckless in a landing environment. But these techniques were specifically designed for aircraft that could not fly normally. Jordan was treating the Airbus A350 like an experimental prototype on its maiden flight, using every trick she had learned during years of test-flying aircraft that existed at the boundaries of controllable flight. The approach required constant adjustments as the aircraft's damaged systems created unpredictable reactions to control inputs. Jordan had to anticipate how the aircraft would respond and make corrections before problems could develop, flying several steps ahead of the aircraft's actual state. The F-35 pilots watched the approach with professional reverence and mounting tension. They understood better than most how difficult this landing would be, and they were ready to immediately coordinate search and rescue if the landing failed. "Valkyrie, this is Ripper. That's some of the finest flying any of us have ever seen. You're making the impossible look ordinary. Thanks for the support, Ripper Flight. Keep those rescue teams on standby just in case." The landing was a tour de force of precision, flying under impossible circumstances. Jordan guided Thorne through a touchdown that was firm but controlled, absorbing the impact of landing with damaged gear and compromised structural integrity. The aircraft bounced once, but settled back onto the runway and began to decelerate. But the emergency was not over. With damaged brakes and asymmetric drag from the destroyed engine, stopping the aircraft demanded techniques that were not in any standard manual. Jordan had Thorne use reverse thrust from the single remaining engine, differential braking that compensated for the damaged systems, and aerodynamic braking techniques that helped slow the aircraft without relying solely on mechanical systems. The Airbus A350 used nearly the entire length of Denver's longest runway before finally rolling to a stop just shy of the overrun area. Emergency vehicles immediately swarmed the aircraft, with fire suppression units, medical teams, and rescue personnel prepared for any contingency. As soon as the aircraft stopped, Jordan helped Thorne shut down all systems in the correct sequence to minimize fire hazards and prepare for an immediate evacuation. The cockpit was thick with smoke from electrical fires, and both pilots needed to get out fast. "Commander, I don't know how to thank you," Thorne said as they prepared to evacuate. "Without you, everyone on this aircraft would have perished. You saved 200 lives today." "You did the flying, Captain," Jordan replied. "I just offered a few suggestions based on my experience with challenging aircraft. Those were more than suggestions. That was flying I didn't know was possible. You turned a hopeless situation into a successful landing." The evacuation proceeded flawlessly, with passengers using emergency slides to exit the aircraft swiftly. Medical staff checked everyone for injuries related to smoke inhalation and the stress of the ordeal, but remarkably, everyone survived with only minor injuries. Outside the aircraft, the F-35s made one final pass over the airport before turning back toward their base. But before they left, Ripper made one last transmission on the emergency frequency. "Valkyrie, this is Ripper Flight. What you did today represents the very highest ideals of military aviation. Your flying skills and judgment under pressure will be studied and remembered throughout the aviation world. It was an honor to support your mission." "Thank you, Ripper Flight. The honor was all mine. Fly safe, and thanks for breaking silence to lend a hand." The incident became international news within hours. Videos from passengers' cell phones showed the harrowing moments when the aircraft seemed completely out of control, followed by the miraculous recovery that saved everyone on board. But the full story of Jordan's role was initially kept under wraps, while military officials reviewed what techniques had been disclosed and what operational security issues arose from the F-35 pilot's choice to break radio silence during a classified exercise. Captain Thorne gave numerous interviews to aviation news outlets, praising the enigmatic Navy officer who had appeared when she was needed most and displayed flying skills that seemed supernatural. However, He was instructed not to reveal her name or specific qualifications pending the military's security assessment. The investigation into the incident took several weeks and involved multiple government agencies. The National Transportation Safety Board scrutinized every detail of the aircraft's failure and the emergency response. The Navy reviewed the techniques that had been used and their potential classification levels. The F-35 pilot's decision to break radio silence was evaluated by military command. The findings were unanimous across all investigating bodies. The emergency had completely justified all actions taken, including the use of experimental flight methods and the F-35 pilot's decision to compromise their training mission. The techniques Jordan had employed should be studied for potential incorporation into both military and civilian emergency training curricula. More importantly, the F-35 pilot's choice to break radio silence was officially lauded by the highest levels of military leadership. Their judgment in prioritizing human life over operational security was held up as a model of proper military decision-making and the core values that define military service. Jordan was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, one of the highest honors for aviation achievement. Her techniques were immediately integrated into advanced pilot training programs across all military branches, and civilian aviation authorities sought her help in developing new emergency protocols. The incident also sparked significant changes in both military and civilian aviation training. Jordan worked directly with the Federal Aviation Administration to create new emergency procedures based on her experience with experimental aircraft, giving commercial pilots new tools for managing situations that went beyond standard training scenarios. But perhaps the most enduring long-term impact was on the relationship between the military and civilian aviation sectors. The F-35 pilots' willingness to compromise their own classified mission to aid a civilian emergency established new protocols for cooperation during crisis events. The Airbus A350 that had nearly crashed was eventually repaired and returned to service after extensive structural repairs and systems replacement. Trans-American Airlines officially renamed the aircraft Valkyrie in honor of the pilot who had saved it, and Captain Thorne requested a permanent assignment to that specific aircraft for the rest of his career. On every flight, Thorne would tell his passengers about the aircraft's history and the extraordinary flying that had saved 200 lives. He never forgot to mention that sometimes heroes show up exactly when you need them, armed with skills and knowledge that seem impossible until they demonstrate that impossible is just another word for techniques that have not yet been learned. 6 months later, Jordan returned to her test pilot duties at Patuxent River, continuing to push the limits of flight and develop new methods that would keep America's military aviators safe in future conflicts. But she also dedicated significant time to civilian pilot training centers, teaching seasoned airline and corporate pilots the advanced techniques that had saved Trans-American 515. Her courses became legendary in the aviation world, known for covering flying skills that existed nowhere else in civilian training. The F-35 pilots who had broken radio silence were both promoted ahead of their peers and became senior instructors at the Navy's elite Top Gun school. They used the Trans-American 515 incident as a case study in decision-making under pressure, illustrating how sound judgment sometimes means breaking rules to uphold higher principles. Major Cole eventually became Colonel Cole and took command of his own F-35 squadron. In his office hung a framed photo of an Airbus A350 landing safely at Denver International Airport with the inscription, "Sometimes the best military mission is saving civilian lives." Captain Petrova became a test pilot herself, inspired by Jordan's example and her ability to make the impossible look routine. She credited the Trans-American 515 incident with inspiring her career shift and her dedication to advancing aviation safety through experimental flight testing. And somewhere in the skies over America, other test pilots continue to push the boundaries of flight, developing techniques and knowledge that might one day save lives in ways they cannot yet imagine. because that is what test pilots do. They fly where others cannot go, learn what others do not know, and develop skills that exist at the very limits of human capability and aircraft performance. And sometimes, when 200 lives hang in the balance at 37,000 feet, those impossible skills turn out to be exactly what the world needs most.